Hey guys, welcome back to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I have Milo Wolf back on the show. He came on previously to discuss his meta-analysis on range of motion and how that impacts muscle hypertrophy, and there's been more information and research coming out about this and the impact of long muscle lengths on hypertrophy. And Milo himself has been so convinced he has been doing a partial range of motion only training style in the lengthened range, and we dig into that, how that's been, his practical experience of that, why he's been doing it, and some future research that he's actually going to be conducting to give us more answers on that. And guys, this is your final reminder. If you haven't noticed, the Improvement Season podcast is no longer on the same podcast provider as the Revive Stronger podcast. Me and Pascal are having our chats over at the Improvement Season podcast. If you're on YouTube, you're in the right place. They're all in the same place. But if you're on a podcast provider, they're now two separate entities. So if you enjoy those chats with me and Pascal, where we kind of talk a load of fun stuff and relate it back to fitness somehow, then definitely search it, find us, and subscribe. We appreciate you having you there. And without further ado, let's get into the chat with Milo. Hi guys, welcome back to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host as always, Steve Hall, and today I have Milo Wolf back on the show. If you didn't know, Milo came on a couple of months ago, maybe it was longer than that. I should have had the episode number down, but you're just going to have to search for Milo. And we were talking about his meta-analysis and systematic review that was released on partial versus full range of motion as it pertains to resistance training, and specifically for us guys, we're interested in muscle hypertrophy. And since then, I've been kind of keeping an eye on kind of this data and also what Milo's doing, because he's over on social media sharing a lot of it and talking about it, which is super interesting. And also his training, which we're going to dig into, because he's kind of, I guess, drastically changed things since, I don't know if you look 6 months ago or a year ago, maybe somewhat drastic. We'll kind of dig into that. And we actually got to train recently, which was really fun. Just this past weekend, we did a full partial range of motion session, which is really cool, just to kind of catch up with Milo, talk about it a bit, and actually kind of practically use it. And some of the listeners might or actually know that I've been kind of implementing a little bit myself and with some clients, and also you guys listening will also know I've asked like the last however many kind of expert guests that have come on the show what their thoughts are on it. And so it's been really interesting kind of talking to people about it, because I think this is like the latest hot thing within resistance training. Kind of like, I don't know, a decade ago it was DUP or whatever. That was like the hot thing within resistance training. And I think this is probably it for now, at least. So Milo, how are things? And give us an update on, I guess, if any of your perspectives have changed, because I know within that kind of conclusion of your meta-analysis, I think it was mentioned that some of the effects were somewhat trivial in terms of the differences between kind of muscle lengths and things like this. And there's been new data come out, which would be cool to hear about if you have that kind of off the top of your head. But yeah, just like a little bit of an update, and then we can dig into maybe some of your training.
100%. So first of all, thank you, Steve, for the kind introduction. I've been good. I've been grinding away at my PhD. I'm in the midst of data collection for 2 studies on range of motion. One on partial range of motion versus full range of motion when the muscle length is equated between conditions. So obviously when you're comparing a partial range of motion to a full range of motion, pretty much always the muscle length is also being manipulated. So you can do a partial range of motion either on average longer or shorter muscle lengths. But the interesting question for this study is whether or not there is an independent effect of range of motion itself on hypertrophy when muscle length is equated between the full range of motion group and the partial range of motion group. So in this case, the partial range of motion group is performing their training in the exact middle 50% of the full range of motion, which hasn't been done before with regards to hypertrophy. So that's why we're doing it. The second study is comparing a full range of motion to lengthened partials, which we'll get more into, I assume, quite soon. Where essentially one group, so this will be in trained lifters, people who've been training for 3 years. In the upper body, given a full training program, 3 days a week for the upper body. And one group will be performing all of their training with a full range of motion, getting as deep of a stretch as they can, getting as much of a peak contraction as they can. Whereas the other group will be instructed via instructional videos and guidelines and so forth to perform all of their training as a lengthened partial. So specifically the first half of the range of motion, where the muscle is fully stretched to coming halfway down. and assessing hypertrophy before and after using ultrasound and a variety of other methods, and assessing strength using 6-rep maxes with both a full range of motion and a partial range of motion. So currently I'm working on both of these studies, and it's taken a part of my soul, but I'm looking forward to the results. And yeah, so for my end, I'm all good. I think my perspectives on range of motion have certainly changed in some ways since our last episode. And I think that's in part due to my rereading of the existing literature a lot more. So I'm maybe halfway through writing my thesis. So that involved me going through each study one by one again and being a bit more methodical. And additionally, some more data has come out, as I'm sure you've been aware of. And broadly speaking, this new data has been supportive of longer muscle length partials as well. So all of this kind of resulted in me starting to take a more, I guess, radical approach in a lot of people's eyes when it comes to range of motion in my training. So I used to kind of flirt with the idea of lower muscle length training being useful via a few different tools. For example, I would pause in the stretch position. I would maybe do a full range of motion set, immediately followed by some lengthened partials, where you just do the bottom half of the rep when the muscle is lengthened. And maybe some other ways of emphasizing lengthened positions, for example, selecting exercises that make sure to really milk that lengthened position, that put a lot of tension on the muscle there, or that make you fail in that position. But more recently, for the past 2 months or so, I've been doing all of my training with exclusively lengthened partials. So except for the 1 or 2 random warm-up sets where I forgot I was doing just half the range of motion, where I accidentally did the full rep, I have pretty much been doing only lengthened partials. And one common question I've gotten is this kind of part of an experiment? And the answer is no, not really. It's based on my reading of the evidence. I think at this point, you can make a very compelling case that at the very least, you're not missing out on anything when using lengthened partials for hypertrophy compared to full range of motion. And you can make, honestly, a stronger case than is true of the opposite, that using lengthened partials will probably produce more muscle growth than using a full range of motion at this point. We can get more into what the evidence says, and specifically the studies that have compared lengthened partials to a full range of motion in a second, but that's why I've changed my approach. And I really hesitate to oversell my own personal experience because, as we've discussed before, Steve, there are a lot of variables involved. It's not as simple as you change one thing in training and you can super easily detect the changes in your results. Measuring hypertrophy is already difficult. It's even more difficult when you're doing it yourself via pictures or by how you look in the mirror. And when we're talking about one small variable within your training program, I'm not sure I could tell anyone anything. I could say something like, oh, I'm getting better pumps or worse pumps or better soreness or worse soreness. I'm not sure how reflective these acute measurements are of long-term hypertrophy. So I wouldn't even be comfortable saying, oh, I got better pumps, therefore it's producing more growth, or vice versa. And likewise, I think 2 months isn't long enough of a time period to really say anything, especially with n equals 1 in this case. I'll say I haven't really noticed the difference either way, which is probably the most accurate I can be, right? I haven't noticed less growth. I haven't really noticed more growth necessarily either, which kind of speaks to the fact that when we're talking about manipulating or changing one variable, like the repetition range you're using, or changing one exercise in your program, you're not going to see a difference, most likely. So yeah, that's been how I've been training. And it's been an interesting change. And I think, as you said, Steve, this topic has gotten a lot of interest over the past few months and years now, I think, like maybe the past year or two, and specifically over the past 6 months. And there's been a lot more evidence coming out as well. So it's been very interesting. But yeah, over to you, Steve.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I'm very excited for particularly the study that you mentioned where you're comparing lengthened partials to full range of motion and having experienced trainees within there. And I think you actually mentioned to me, if we can say this, that you're also looking to run it, because you said that's 8 weeks, but I think you said you're going to try and keep it going for additional time after this because, like you just mentioned, muscle growth within natural trainees is so damn slow. How much will you see in the 8 weeks will be interesting, but extending that will be really interesting.
100%. And because we're talking about a relatively small impact in all likelihood, one thing we did was not only are we going to have this study running for about a year or two, and so we're going to be collecting data over that whole time period, But in order to increase sample size and improve our ability to detect differences between a full range of motion and lengthened partials, we are also conducting data collection at several universities at once. So we're doing this currently. The universities that have confirmed taking part are my own university, Solent University in Southampton, Sheffield Hallam University in the UK, the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens in Greece, the Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand, and finally the University of South Florida in South Florida. And so this way, if we have the study running for a year or two, we should be able to get, my estimate, maybe around 50 to 100 people or more. And honestly, it's still not a huge sample size for a relatively small effect, but it's certainly a bigger sample size than we would have otherwise been able to get. And I think that way this study can be sort of the first big study on this concept. And I think the sort of two routes you can go is either you have several smaller studies that you then aggregate in a meta-analysis, for example, or you can go the route of, okay, well, let's take our time, involve several universities, coordinate a project, and get a bigger sample size so that we can have a more informative study ultimately.
This is just a random thought that came to my head as I was thinking of, like, obviously the limitations with this are like individual differences, the genetic component, and then you're not kind of controlling for nutrition, which would be really tough to have that on top as well. I wonder if you could like get them to flip, like they do the partials for that period of time, and then they have to do full ROM. I don't know if that would even, if there's any impact on doing one before the other, and that could have a role, but that would be interesting as well, I think.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That is one way you could do it. The issue there is obviously if people are willing to take part in a study for 8 weeks, that's one thing. But getting them to take part in a study for 16 weeks, plus an additional few measurement sessions in the lab, etc., that can be a bit more challenging. Ultimately, it's kind of a trade-off, right? Either you do it for 8 weeks and you don't have that aspect to the design and you can get more people in, and so that inherently reduces variance on a group level, or you can get them to cross over. It takes 16 weeks, fewer people take part, but the variance is also lower because in that case, you've somewhat controlled for genetics, sleep, etc., assuming that they're reasonably similar people during the full range of motion program and during the partial lengthened program. But yeah, certainly there's a lot of cool aspects to methods that you can consider. So for example, for the previous study, the calf study, where we were doing either a full range of motion or a partial range of motion, but equating for muscle length, because with that study, we're not too concerned about how it directly translates to real roles, because no one trains one calf one way and the other calf another way, usually, except for Eric Helms. By using a within subject design, where one leg is being trained with a full range of motion and with a partial range of motion, we're able to reduce variance because ultimately, those two legs belong to the same person with the same nutrition, the same sleep, the same genetics, etc. So you can definitely design a study in certain clever ways, let's say, to make a study more informative, more powered, and better able to detect differences in, say, hypertrophy resulting from range of motion differences.
Yeah, the studies where they do one arm or one leg and they do the other one with the other side, they're really, really cool. I can't imagine what it's like to be a participant in that. It must feel like you're getting, it's proving muscle confusion. Maybe there's something to that. And anyway, I'm on a complete tangent. Where was I going to go? So yes, I was going to talk about, you've been doing this for a couple of months, a little bit over that, where you've been doing the kind of partial lengths. And I guess when I'm thinking about measuring muscle growth for an advanced bodybuilder, you mentioned some short-term heuristics, which again, how much evidence is there for those? It's very challenging to say too much. But then one of the longer-term ones would be like performance increases, at least in like the hypertrophy rep range. I imagine for you, because these movements were fairly new, you saw quite rapid improvements initially and they've maybe slowed down. And maybe, I guess you can say it's not been enough time to say if your performance, in my mind, if your performance is increasing faster through lengthened partials, maybe there was something to the fact that that's indicative of growing muscle a little bit quicker than when you were training with full ROM.
100%. So what's interesting here, I think, is that it really depends on the exercise. What I found is that exercises that are already inherently most challenging in a relatively lengthened position, those didn't see a huge improvement in strength from when I started to now, which makes sense, right? Like, let's say, for example, for a bench press or for a squat, those exercises are already very challenging in a lengthened position. And so by switching from a full range of motion to a lengthened partial, you're not inherently changing the exercise all that much. And so I wouldn't expect to see rapid strength increases as a result of doing partials on those. However, for exercises like dumbbell lateral raises or pull downs, for example, I have noticed relatively substantial strength improvements from when I started doing lengthened partials to now. And that's generally been my experience. And certainly that is also the trend I expect to see in the upper body study. I'll be taking part myself, actually, starting in about 3 days. I'll be randomizing myself to either the full range of motion or the partial range of motion group. And that's sort of the group effect I expect to see, is that the group training with lengthened partials will probably see pretty substantial improvements in their lengthened partial strength. And they'll probably see like a maintenance or slight improvement in their full range of motion strength. Whereas the full range of motion group, I expect will see slight improvements in their full range of motion strength as well, because they've been training for a long time already, like 3 years at least in the study. I don't expect there to be huge improvements over 8 weeks. And I think their lengthened partials may slightly increase as well. But certainly I think the improvement in lengthened partial strength will be greater in the lengthened partial group because it's more novel. They haven't specifically trained that range of motion as directly before as their full range of motion. And so I think that's generally true, but I think the effect is larger for exercises that are usually not that challenging in the lengthened position, like, for example, pull downs or lateral raises or even curls.
That makes a lot of sense. It's kind of one I'd been experimenting with was pulling movements, where you are kind of strongest where it's easiest generally with pulling movements, and then you're weakest where it's hardest. And so like getting it short is really, really challenging. And so when I had tried lengthened partials, I was like, wow, I can really grind out a lot more reps, and my reps are really going up if I'm maintaining load, because I essentially was using them as like a full ROM set and then a partial ROM set. So I don't know if that means, and I wonder what your take on this would be, with some exercises and muscle groups doing full ROM versus partials, there might be trivial differences. But for some like back, maybe there's a bigger difference because of that inherent disbalance between strength and where it's hardest with the movement.
I 100% agree. And I think it's interesting because you could go one of two ways, right? You could say, well, if in the squat, for example, the top position is quite easy anyways, and the bottom position is already quite challenging, there's not really a big difference between saying doing lengthened partials and doing a full range of motion. So you could say, well, may as well just do a full range of motion. But you could also say, well, there's not a big difference, why not just lengthen partials, you know? So you could go either way. And ultimately, I think on those exercises, it likely makes less of a difference whether you choose to do a full range of motion or lengthen partials. So I guess there could be a bit more room for personal preference. Whereas if you're someone who values results on exercises like pull downs or rows, there might be a bit less room for personal preference. And certainly I think there have been, and I did this in the past myself as well. As I said, I've flirted with other ways of enhancing the stretch emphasis in my program. But I think the most direct application of the research we do have is just to lengthen partials. Ultimately, in these studies, none of these studies have looked at pausing in a lengthened position or at performing a stretched or lengthened superset, where you do a full range of motion set followed by lengthened partials. None of these studies have looked at that. So while it stands to reason that those could be effective ways of enhancing the hypertrophy effect, quote unquote, of an exercise or a set, it hasn't been studied. Whereas we have pretty consistently now studied the effect of lengthened partials on hypertrophy. And so if you want to maximize your certainty or the likelihood that your approach to training is effective, why not just actually do what they did in the research? That's sort of my view on applying this research now, is that the most direct way of applying it is probably the most surefire way of benefiting from it.
Makes complete sense. It's kind of like, I don't know, at least the way I felt like I was applying it sometimes, it's kind of holding on to the full range of motion, and you're like, oh no, I just dipped my toe in, kind of like when I first found out about like macros and calories being key and not like food composition and clean food wasn't the be all and end all. And I was like, oh, I'll just have a little bit of cereal post workout. I'll dip my toe in. And eventually you realize, oh, okay, actually, maybe this is actually a philosophy I can kind of go with. And that makes sense. And I guess you could take it even as far as like what exercises and muscle groups have been trained and just use those ones like the preachers, the leg extension, that sort of thing.
You could, although I'm skeptical of the rationale that different muscle groups respond differently to stretch-mediated hypertrophy. So there have been some prominent figures in the industry that have made that claim. I actually got into a bit of a feud with Paul Cotter, for example, over this. I think we just don't have enough clarity on what the mechanisms are behind stretch-mediated hypertrophy. That's a misnomer because it's not as though just existing a long muscle length gives you hypertrophy. It's being in a lengthened position plus lifting there. But we don't really understand the mechanisms behind stretch-mediated hypertrophy. And so if you're going into the discussion and the thought process of what muscle groups benefit from it, thinking that you know for sure that an increase in fascicle length is the only adaptation that could potentially be responsible for greater hypertrophy following lengthened partial work, then yeah, you're going to assume that if we don't see an increase in fascicle length, that muscle group doesn't benefit from lengthened partials or lengthened work. But that's simply not something we have any certainty over yet. And so certainly I haven't really noticed any trends in the evidence as far as like, oh, whenever we study the triceps, for example, there's no effect. That's not been the case. Like we've had 3 studies on the triceps. Broadly speaking, 2 of these supported longer muscle length work, whereas 1 didn't find a difference. Same with pretty much every other muscle group. Like when there's been several studies on a muscle group, they've broadly speaking supported longer muscle length training too. And so I think we can likely at this point generalize this principle. We can generalize it to probably all muscle groups. I think it's a safe bet at this point. If you're really skeptical, you could certainly just stick with the muscle groups that have been studied directly. But I think, and that's partly why we're doing the whole upper body in this study. We're not just doing like the biceps or the triceps, because we haven't really looked at this concept in an ecologically valid context of a whole program, not just in the biceps or just the triceps. But I think at this point, there's pretty compelling evidence that you can generalize this concept to all muscle groups, to be honest.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And I think most people I've asked, when I've asked them on the podcast, if they think it differs between muscle groups, they tend to think, that, like in their practical experience and what they've maybe read of the literature, they tend to agree with you there that it is a generalizable principle. And I would also say that with my experience with myself and clients and who seem to be like responding well to various exercises, it does seem to be pretty generalized across the board. That does bring a question though, and I guess you've covered that argument against lengthened partials. And I imagine there are some other ones, but I guess I would ask you, do you see any downside, any risks involved? Because I guess some people are worried about like injuries and things like this. Have you experienced any downsides to using lengthened partials versus full ROM?
So I think with regards to injuries specifically, you probably want to transition somewhat gradually into them. I think ultimately, if you've been performing full range of motion training, you have exposed yourself to those positions before under load. So you're not going to, unless you go from not training the lengthened position at all to training it super hard, I don't think there's a huge risk there. But I think just like going from low volume to high volume, you don't just want to jump from 5 sets a week to 30 sets a week. Generally speaking, same with rep ranges, etc. You want to sort of ease yourself in. So I think giving it a few weeks of transition period might be a good idea. But I think generally speaking, with lifting weights, injury rates are pretty low to begin with, and the injuries are generally pretty minor. So we certainly don't have any evidence directly suggesting that lengthened partials would be more injurious, right? Like one claim that I've seen bandied around about full range of motion is that it makes lifts safer. I think the evidence surrounding that is pretty weak. Like I think you can, if you straw man partial range of motion users into purely doing it for the ego component of using more weight and like, not paying attention to overall load management or not putting appropriate safety precautions into place. Yeah, potentially there could be something there. But if we're talking about a partial range of motion on principle applied well versus a full range of motion on principle also applied well, I'm not sure there's a meaningful or even detectable difference. We don't have any evidence to suggest there is, to my knowledge. So yeah, I think injury-wise, it shouldn't be a huge concern. One thing I could say is that we do have some research in chronically injured people, for example, people with chronic non-specific lower back pain, where training at either extreme of the range of motion, for example, super short muscle lengths or super long muscle lengths, does seem to sometimes increase pain a little bit. So if you have an existing injury and you find lengthened partials pretty painful, you may be better off training at more moderate muscle lengths and excluding the super shortened or super lengthened position. That could be one exception there. I think another downside potentially to lengthened partials is logistics. So for some exercises, you may just not have enough weight available to make them work. Like for pull downs nowadays, for example, or even for rows. We did machine rows in your gym, Steve, recently. And we were doing a set of 10 to 15 after doing, I want to say, both pull-ups and pullovers, right?
Yeah.
And we used a full stack for 10 to 15 reps. So realistically, if we get much stronger, we're either going to have to be very particular about the rep range being used, or we're going to have to find a different exercise. there's not really an option there. And I've had the same experience on certain machines. For example, my pull down machine nowadays, I'm almost maxing out or close to maxing out for relatively high reps. So there is a logistical issue there where by using a full range of motion, you may be able to get a good stimulus, train closer to failure, even though you don't have enough weight available for lengthened partials. The final one, which is probably the most brought up one, but I think almost the least valid one or least used one, is standardization. So I think conceptually, it is something that can matter. But I think it matters less than people think, and it's easier to standardize lengthened partials than people realize. And I don't really blame them because most people haven't actually tried it. Here's why I don't think it matters as much as people think. One, it's more so training hygiene, I think, than it is like a robust improver of training stimulus. I think it can help you make sure that you're training sufficiently hard and that you're progressing long term. But ultimately, whether your range of motion this session was perfectly the same as last session doesn't really change how stimulating that session was, right? If we're assuming that range of motion has a small impact on hypertrophy, a very small difference in range of motion one session to the next is really, really, really not going to have a big effect on your hypertrophy effect from that session, right? Or from that exercise. So that's why I consider it more of a training hygiene thing, and that can help you track progress over time or ensure you're training sufficiently hard rather than something to be really worried about or really concerned. And then the second, probably more important point here is that a lot of exercises and machines inherently allow you to standardize range of motion. So going back to the machine row example, Steve, we did some machine rows in your gym, and you can use certain landmarks or features of the machine as like an ending point for the range of motion. So you know, okay, well, if I don't pull to this point here, this notch in the machine, for example, or this number that's written on the machine, I haven't completed the rep. And you know when you get a full stretch, for example. So you can pretty easily standardize range of motion on a lot of machines. And so I think at least half of the exercises you perform in the gym are easily standardizable. And it's interesting because we recently performed some reliability testing in the gym. So in preparation for this upper body study, we had a few people go through 6 repetition maximum testing using lengthened partials. So on the pull down, for example, we had a few people do a 6 rep max test, just doing lengthened partials. So from a full stretch to halfway down on one day after some rest. And again, a few days later, again, after some rest. And we looked at how consistent they were in their numbers that they hit. So presumably, if we struggled to control for range of motion and standardize range of motion session to session, then you would see wildly different numbers from one session to the next, even though you were trying to hit the same range of motion, right? What we saw is that it was very, very reliable. So if you know anything about intra-class correlation coefficients, it's just a measure of reliability. It was about 0.99, and one being perfect. And that's in people who have somewhere between no experience with lengthened partials and minimal experience, right? So honestly, I think the standardization concern is overblown. I don't think standardization itself has a huge effect on the hypertrophy stimulus. And I think it's an overblown concern in terms of how much it actually happens with lengthened partials.
I really like that discussion around standardization because I think it's kind of the fallacy of, I don't know, perfect technique. It's like you're not going to be a robot and literally do every rep exactly the same. There's going to be small deviances in tempo, even like positioning within the lift. There could be small deviances, just like there's going to be small deviances to some of your nutrition or your sleep or your stress. Like you can keep things as standardized as possible, but like there's going to be small deviances. So I don't stress about those small things. I just like them to be within a range. And that's where my experience with lengthened partials is kind of like you mentioned, like it's very standardizable within a range. And I guess, I mean, people will see when I chuck up the vlog because I hadn't been doing lengthened partials for the last 3 or 4 weeks. So then I was doing them new in that session, and you'll be able to see that, I don't know, I haven't actually watched the footage, but I imagine they are pretty standardized. And it's like you said, as long as you give yourself certain check marks, that's fairly easy. On the lengthened partials, actually one question that's been running through my mind a few times. So you mentioned it's 50% of kind of the beginning range of motion. Have you thought about how, like, less? I guess you have. Like, how much is too little, too much? Like, how lengthened do we just, I guess it would go all the way from like 50, 40, 30, 20 to then just doing a stretch like Eric is currently doing on his calves.
Absolutely. I have thought about that. The short answer is we don't have enough evidence about range of motion as a concept to even come close to having an answer there of, okay, well, a third of a rep is best. A lengthened partial that's a third of the full range of motion is best for hypertrophy. We've got it. We got the answer. It applies to every muscle group. We can't say that. What we can do is look at what the existing studies have used for lengthened partials as a guideline for what we should use in training if we're trying to replicate the results of these studies. Generally, the range of motion being used as a lengthened partial compared to full range of motion is about a third to half of the full range of motion. So it's a pretty big range, to be honest. And this is something that I was going to mention in regards to standardization, is that in your own training, you don't necessarily need to aim for perfectly 50% of full range of motion. You can base it off of what is standardizable and repeatable. So for some machines, you'll have a landmark for example, 1/3 of full range of motion, and you can use that and consistently just do 1/3. Or if it has a landmark around 50%, just use that instead. We don't have enough evidence to suggest that there's a difference there. And I think if standardization is a big concern of yours, you can be a bit flexible on exactly how much range of motion you use, provided it's within a sort of effective range, or study range rather, that we have good evidence on it being more effective than full range of motion with. And I think that can really alleviate some of those concerns. The question of how much range of motion is appropriate or even ideal for hypertrophy is a really, really interesting one. Ultimately, it crosses over into the isometric versus concentric and eccentric literature, for example. And this is why one of the projects that I've been meaning to get into for a while now is a systematic review comparing the effects of isometric only versus, for example, concentric and eccentric contractions on hypertrophy, because there hasn't been such a review done yet. And it would be interesting to see whether, on principle, isometric contractions, for example, are less stimulative of hypertrophy than concentric and eccentric contractions. Because if they're not, it may just turn out to be true that lengthened isometric holds are the best for hypertrophy, and we don't even need to move anymore. We can just hold the weight. That would be great. But that's something I want to get to after my PhD is over, provided no one's done it by then yet. If they do, that'd be great too, because less work for me, hey? Yeah. But that's something I've been meaning to get into. And ultimately, at some point, there may be a reason to compare lengthened isometric holds to, for example, lengthened partials or to full range of motion, and see whether hypertrophy differs there. I think for now, we can sort of start the research landscape off by comparing lengthened partials to full range of motion and seeing what is the difference there. And then we can gradually move more into the minutiae if there is a reason to do so. Like if full range of motion turns out to be just as good as lengthened partials, then there might not really be a reason to look into lengthened isometrics, because ultimately on that spectrum from full range of motion to no range of motion, they're on a far end of that spectrum, right? And so if there is no difference between full range of motion and partial range of motion, there's not necessarily a compelling reason to try and see whether there's any differences with the further end of the spectrum. So I think that's an interesting question. It's something I want to look more into in the future, but I have thought about it. I don't think we have enough evidence there. I think we're just starting to get enough evidence to be fairly convinced about lengthened partials being good for hypertrophy. And maybe in the future we'll have more evidence about isometrics, but for now that's how things stand, I think.
Do you not see the progress you would like? Are you sick of writing your own programs? Or perhaps you need some accountability in order to stick with a plan? Then it's time to start working with us. We at Revive Stronger offer a truly personalized coaching service. You'll get more than just an email with some macros or random cookie cutter program. With Revive Stronger, you will be the center of our attention. You will receive your own fully individualized training protocol alongside a customized nutritional strategy. We created the coaching around your needs, wants, personal preferences, and your own unique lifestyle. Every single week, we delve into your program in order to make appropriate adjustments so that we get the most out of your time and the best possible outcome. We help both female and male athletes to seriously change their body composition by adding more muscle mass and decreasing fat tissue. No matter if you're a competitive bodybuilder or just want to look better, if you need help with your progress and taking your physique to the next level, our coaching is for you. It's time to make a change. Sign up today and let's revive stronger.
I don't know if you've read it, but Eric sent me it. He talked about it when I brought him on a while ago to talk about kind of length and range of motion. It's called Isometrics or Steroids, Exploring the New Frontiers of, I don't actually know what it's the new frontiers of. That's all I got. Have you heard of that? Have you read that one?
I have not. I have seen the study that Eric Helms, that spurred Eric Helms to use that device on his calf.
Okay.
The Warnicki study, but I haven't read that study, no.
This was, I think it's, I don't know if actually know if it's a study or not. I'll have to, Eric sent me it and I still haven't taken the time to read it. He kind of described it. And I think it was something along the lines of like many years ago, I don't know how long ago it was like isometric training, or like stretching was made out to be as good as steroids. And then clearly it completely died off and didn't become anything. So I think that led to him being skeptical that it would work. But then obviously he's doing the calf study now, and I have a feeling it's going to show promising things for his calves, and it means I'm going to have to purchase some orthotic device and start sitting here and stretching my calves.
I'm actually seeing Eric Helms in March, and I can't wait to see him with a 24-inch calf and a 16-inch calf. It will look very amusing.
Absolutely. So yeah, one of the things I was going to ask was, I think in one of your posts, just talking about like the practical application of lengthened partials, you mentioned, I think, about breathing on certain lifts, and that's something you've had to kind of, I guess it's like we're talking off air, you're like, when you start a podcast, you just have to start and then you kind of work out what's going on and like you know what you need to do. So I guess that you're a good person to ask about lengthened partials, where some people might start getting into it and they're like, oh my gosh, there's like these challenges. Are there any challenges like breathing that you've had to like work around?
Yeah, certainly I'll say it took a bit of getting used to with regards to breathing patterns. Off the cuff, I'll say that breathing patterns haven't actually been studied that directly with regards to, let's say we compare one group breathing a certain way versus another group breathing another way, performing the exact same program and hypertrophy before and after. We don't really have any of those studies. So at this point, we're sort of going like, what breathing pattern acutely increases performance? And then we assume that if a breathing pattern can acutely increase performance within a session, that if we repeat that over multiple sessions, that over time, this might lead to more hypertrophy, right? That's an assumption. That's fine. It just makes for easier studies to run ultimately, because no one wants to run training studies, least of all me, but I've been doing 2 anyways. But so it just means that with breathing, I think there's a lot more leeway and a lot less evidence that should dictate exactly what you do than people realize. The same with injury risk, not a ton of evidence there either, at least not direct evidence. So I'd say you can be a bit more flexible with regards to breathing patterns than you might think. And so that's why going into lengthened partials and breathing being a challenge, I wasn't really too concerned about it. I thought it might require some adjustment, but ultimately, whatever feels most comfortable and strongest was probably fine. I will say for exercises that are compound in nature, so multi-joint, and for the lower body, like RDLs, squats, etc., I think that's probably where it took the most adjustment, because ultimately it feels a bit unsettling if you're used to bracing on the way up until you get all the way up and there's no tension essentially, and then breathing out and breathing in again. It feels a bit unsettling to exhale while you're still at a relatively hard part of lift. But I think the way I found it best is to still breathe out at the top of the concentric. So in the squat, that would be for a lengthened partial, just above parallel essentially. Breathe out, and then instantly, or as quickly as you can, breathe back in and brace. I have played around with breathing out at the top and then breathing in all the way down to the bottom. But I found that even though it's the eccentric part of the range of motion and it's of the lift, and it's relatively easier than the concentric phase, it's still challenging enough that it feels a bit off-putting or weak to breathe in and out on the way down. And so I would rather like be a bit more out of breath and breathe in and brace at the top of each rep than breathe in and out on the way down and feel a bit more unstable or weaker potentially. Certainly, I think there's some wiggle room there. So you might try breathing in at the top and holding it and find it not very comfortable. If that's the case for you, try breathing on the way down. It may help you. Honestly, ultimately, what I think is start from a place that most people find comfortable and that is supported by the evidence. In this case, we don't have a ton of evidence, so I think it's mostly what's most comfortable and practical for most people and strongest, and then adjust from there as you find what's most comfortable for you specifically.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think one other thing that just kind of popped into my head is, I know there are proponents of constant tension, for example, where you need to kind of have this constant tension and that's going to build more muscle mass, I guess is the simplest way of saying the argument. And I guess that's sort of what you're achieving through a lengthened partial. Do you think that does anything to change the results or the kind of conclusions? Do you think like the constant tension, like that's part of it in this?
I don't think so. I think the studies that have tried to induce quote unquote constant tension haven't really shown that constant tension produces greater hypertrophy than a full range of motion oftentimes, or than any other range of motion. And I think while there is some truth to the fact that using a partial range of motion can make the whole of that range of motion challenging, in some cases it's not necessarily true. So for example, doing lengthened partials on dumbbell lateral raises, yes, you're now making the bottom part of that range of motion more stimulating and making it constant tension, quote unquote, by just using enough weight to make it challenging, right? But there will still be positions every now and then where, relatively speaking, the force production requirements are extremely low, right? Like the very bottom of a dumbbell lateral raise, there's essentially no force production requirements, and you can modify your technique to make it more productive potentially. So this is something that we discussed, Steve, in our session, was for exercises where the lengthened position doesn't have very high force production requirements, like the bottom of a dumbbell lateral raise, right? You could put in very little force and the dumbbell would still move up in the right direction. What you can do is towards the very end of the eccentric phase, when your muscle is lengthening and lengthening, you can slow it down, as slowing it down more will require more force production. And so you can essentially produce more force at lower muscle lengths and thus make it potentially slightly better for hypertrophy. And likewise, on the way up, so at the start of the concentric phase for a dumbbell lateral raise, for example, you can try and be as explosive as possible out of the bottom, because being explosive, moving the weight more quickly, will require more force production, and hopefully more force production at lower muscle lengths is a good thing for hypertrophy. And so I think you can kind of make up for the inherent limitation of certain exercises, like for example, the dumbbell lateral raise not having high force production requirements in a lengthened position, by using lengthened partials, because that means that you can make that part of the range of motion more challenging by using more weight, and B, potentially also by being a bit more purposeful with your tempo, for example, by slowing down the eccentric towards the bottom and by being as explosive as possible out of the lengthened position.
I think, I don't know if the right word is good lifters, but I'd say more advanced lifters who are very in tune with their body may have been manipulating some of these things without realizing that that's what they were kind of doing it for, where, again, you talked about the stimulus in terms of disruption and the pump and everything not being like obvious, like linked to hypertrophy necessarily. But I'm just thinking of like when I do bent over rows, for example, that's, as you described that for the dumbbell lateral raise, and I do it for dumbbell lateral raises, and I had been for a while, where purposefully like slowing down that bottom position, really trying to powerfully come out of it. And I guess even to the point of generating a bit of momentum to help it to get to the short position where I'm weaker. It's kind of like, I guess you could argue, why use that exercise when it's made in a way that isn't suited for what you're trying to achieve. But if you can manipulate these variables in terms of tempo and you can play it to your favor, you're kind of like, you're changing a lift inherently to be maybe a little bit more suitable.
Yeah, and ultimately, what you see with exercising behaviors in general, like whether it comes to what exercise you use, how long you exercise for, and all types of things, it's not as simple as people just use what's best. People aren't machines, right? They have preferences. They have practical constraints. Like, for example, what if you don't have cables? What if you're training at home? You still want to find ways to make your training more productive oftentimes. And so I think there is definitely a place for even these quote unquote less effective exercises. And I think depending on your setup, if you have enough weight available, for example, lengthened partials can be a nice way to make more of the exercises that you have at your disposal. Because ultimately, I love to have prime machines for every exercise and be able to load the lengthened position perfectly. But a lot of us don't have that. And I think the impact of equipment can sometimes be overstated. And I think the impact of equipment can be made up for example, via lengthened partials, by making that lengthened position more challenging via those sort of potentially small modifications to tempo. But it's interesting to see also that you mentioned, people have kind of been doing this intuitively, because that's something people have brought up. It's like, oh, well, the bros have been doing this, or the pros have been doing this forever. Bros and pros, I guess. And that's true, but the bros and pros have also been doing lots of shit forever, and they kind of just throw shit at the wall and see what sticks. And sometimes they're right, So,
yeah, I was just gonna say it did come to mind that like a lot of the lifts that people have been using for years are like I mean, they're making use of this like lengthened position, but equally a lot of those kind of bros in the past and what have you have been doing like half range of motion leg press, for example. They're certainly not coming all the way down. So you definitely, that's why anecdote falls on its face very often, because yeah, you might get some gems, but it's very mixed.
100%. And this even goes to a few things. One is this idea of the peak contraction being really important. Like, that's something that was bro gospel for a long time. And the evidence really doesn't support that. It really doesn't. And then another thing is bros and pros using knee wraps, and to a much lesser extent, knee sleeves. Knee wraps would, do a few things. One thing I'm less confident in, but I'll mention it anyways, is that by using knee wraps, you're able to use more weight. All else being equal, that might not be a good thing for fatigue. In terms of, like, your quads are still able to lift the load by the assistance of the knee wraps, but your lower back still has to stabilize that weight, etc. But more importantly, knee wraps, and to a lesser extent, knee sleeves, both make it a bit harder to get longer muscle lengths. Like, it sort of restricts range of motion slightly. You can't get as deep. And they make that part of the range of motion easier, which is the complete opposite of what we want. We want to get, in all likelihood, there's actually some new studies that are kind of trying to hash out which is more important, but we probably want to get really long muscle lengths and plenty of tension there. Knee wraps, and to a lesser extent, knee sleeves, are doing the opposite of that. And so generally, if a lifter is comfortable with it, for example, I will say, oh, let's try not using knee sleeves, because knee sleeves do make it a bit harder to get quite as deep, and they do provide some bounce off the hole, which is not what we want for hypertrophy.
Yeah, I completely agree. I don't know why it was a trend. When you compete in bodybuilding, you become a powerlifter afterwards. It's like the off-season thing to do was, now you compete in powerlifting. And so after my first season, that's what I did. I went into powerlifting afterwards. I got the SBD knee sleeves. You always get them a size down so they're as tight as possible. And they 100% give you, I don't know what percent you could put to it, but they definitely give you a percentage of extra bounce out the bottom and make that easier. No doubt about it. So you're completely right on that. And I think that, again, I guess talking about the bros and pros or whatever, they've just maybe lifted in a slightly less than great way for fatigue management that's led them to need these things almost. And then, I don't know, natural bodybuilders and smaller, younger guys pick it up and they're like, oh, look what they're doing. I should be wearing these too. And it's like, oh no, it's like a horrible negative feedback loop where they're just copying the mistakes almost. So this is why we need research like what you're doing, Milo, which is fantastic. It starts validating or not validating what the bros were doing.
100%. And I think it's easy to just straw man a training camp or what have you into saying, oh, they're just doing this for ego or what have you. And in some cases, it's absolutely true. Like, if you're talking about someone who's using knee wraps for the purpose of lifting more weight and keeping them on over time because they don't want to see a reduction in how much weight they're lifting, yeah, in all likelihood, in that case, it is for ego. But I think if you're dichotomizing range of motion users into either, for example, full range of motion being not ego driven at all and just doing it for the sake of optimizing hypertrophy, and the other camp is partial range of motion users only using a partial range of motion to lift more weight, then it's a very easy argument to win. But ultimately, you could go the other way and say, hey, for range of motion users, just want to feel better about how much range of motion they got and how deep they are and how deep they go and how much better they are than partial range of motion users, right? But that's not an argument I'm going to make because it's silly. It's not a strong argument. So yeah, I think it's interesting to see that when you take ego at the equation and when you look at the literature, there are certain things that turn out to be better than others. And it's, coming into my PhD, actually, my bias probably was that my studies would find that full range of motion was best for hypertrophy. And I was like, based on literature, having not read too deeply into it at the time, I was like, yeah, full range of motion is probably best, but there's not that much evidence yet, so I may as well add to the body of evidence. And gradually, and I think you noticed this, Steve, my mind sort of shifted from I'm going to use full range of motion only because it's best for hypertrophy to actually the evidence suggests that lengthened positions are pretty important to, well, the evidence actually suggests we have 4 studies now comparing lengthened partials to full range of motion for hypertrophy. That evidence is remarkably consistent in showing that lengthened partials are either as good for hypertrophy as full range of motion or better. Not a single study comparing lengthened partials to full range of motion has shown worse hypertrophy for lengthened partials. Generally, the trend is that for more distal measurement sites, so for the biceps, for example, closer to the elbow, lengthened partials or more lengthened work is better for hypertrophy than full range of motion or more shortened work. And that's been remarkably consistent across, like, not even just lengthened partials versus full range of motion, but also within lengthened partials versus shortened partials, or isometric contractions, that's short muscle lengths versus long muscle lengths. Like, there's several bodies of evidence that all converge on the fact that longer muscle length work is good. It's especially good for distal hypertrophy, whereas for proximal hypertrophy, they're a bit more equivalent. But it's also been remarkably consistent when comparing lengthened partials to full range of motion specifically, in that not once has there been worse hypertrophy following lengthened partials compared to full range of motion. There's only been similar hypertrophy or better hypertrophy for lengthened partials. And so that's why at this point, I kind of see lengthened partials, if your primary or only goal is hypertrophy, I kind of see lengthened partials as a no-lose situation. You know, you can't really lose based on the evidence. You're probably gaining something, but at the very least, I'd be very skeptical that you're missing out on anything for hypertrophy.
Yeah, and I think that's why I've been so like keeping up with what you're doing and the research you're doing, because this is why I like the evidence-based space, because people like yourself, Brad Schoenfeld's really good at it as well. It's just like following the science with it. It's not like, I forget what it was called, like the volume, I don't know, the team volume, like whatever. It's like Brad didn't care if it was more sets, less sets, whatever. He just wanted to know, or how much volume needed to be done to maximize results. And the same with you. Like you said, your bias going into this was actually you thought full range of motion would do better. And you've just been following the science and what that's telling you and passing that over to like the layman, really. And as a practitioner, I'm absorbing it and like trying to learn and see how I can apply it. And as a competitor as well, because this should give me maybe, like you mentioned, it's not going to be night and day versus full range of motion. But if it can give that little bit of extra for no cost, like it's almost a win-win in this sort of scenario. So unless your preferences are like dead set against it and you're like really struggling with the concept.
100%. And I think the reason, for example, my meta-analysis, when you looked at full range of motion versus partial range of motion for hypertrophy, found that there was a trivial effect in favor of full range of motion, is because when you dichotomize ranges of motion into being purely full or partial, then you miss out on certain nuances to the data, right? And I think that's also part of the reason why a lot of people nowadays are reluctant to give lengthened partials a shot, is because much of the evidence so far hasn't done a super good job of hashing out, okay, well, maybe not all partials are created equal for hypertrophy. Maybe lengthened partials are substantially different from shortened partials because muscle length is not the same. And maybe muscle length is the thing we should be paying attention to, really. And that's why in that meta-analysis, for example, there was a trivial effect in favor of full range of motion. But nowadays, when you look at the differences between lengthened partials and full range of motion, it's pretty consistent. So yeah, it's been an interesting journey, to say the least, throughout this range of motion PhD.
Yeah, I'm interested to keep following, and obviously interested in this calf study, and then like the full ROM versus the lengthened range of motion as well. I don't know is there anything people can do? I think you I hadn't read it. I have to apologize. But are you still looking for participants? I saw something being shared at one point, which I meant to share as well. Is that something that's happening? Yeah,
absolutely. So we actually started data collection literally yesterday for the upper body study. So I went through coordinating all the files and making sure that every site had what it needed to get started. And so I started data collection yesterday, so taking people through some body composition measurements. But yes, so for the next year or two, for the upper body study specifically, we'll be asking for people to take part. As I said, it's taking part in 2 locations in the UK, in Southampton and Sheffield. It's taking place in Athens in Greece. It's taking place in Auckland in New Zealand. And it's taking place in South Florida in the US. If you're anywhere close to these locations, you could pretty easily take part. So I've got a few friends that might be taking part that live a few hours away from me. And it's as simple as spending 2 days or even a day, essentially, in one of these locations before and after the 8 weeks. Because all we want to do is take you to a lab twice. It can be on any 2 days. So it could be on, for example, tomorrow and Thursday, right? So Wednesday and Thursday. And we take you through some body composition measurements, and then we give you the program. It's all online. We can correspond by email. You upload some videos for us to make sure that your range of motion is appropriate. But you only need to be in one of these labs 2 days before the study and 2 days afterwards. So realistically, if you're anywhere close to these locations, you can take part. And all of the training for these 8 weeks takes part in your own gym, on your own schedule, etc. So if you're anywhere close to these locations, please do reach out. You can reach out to me. You can go into my Instagram and find a post where we have a link for a survey that will direct you to the closest location for you, etc. But if you're anywhere close, please do consider taking part. It will go a long way towards science, and more importantly, to be honest, the only science that matters, which is getting us more jacked.
Yeah. That's awesome. I'll make sure I find that link and insert that in the description as well. And whilst we're at it, might as well let people know where they can keep following you. And I know also with Dr. Pack, who's been on the podcast, you guys have even launched your own Muscle and Feels podcast, which I've dug into a few episodes. It's been fun listening to those. So definitely plug that too.
Thank you, man. I appreciate that. So you can find me on Instagram at wolfcoach. So that's my last name, Wolf and Coach, with an underscore afterwards. You can find our podcast at Muscle and Feels. So that's kind of a play on the old Muscle and Fitness magazine. And then finally, I've got my own website at wolfcoaching.net. And if you want to find my research output, like my systematic review and so forth, you just search Milo Wolf, my full name, ResearchGate, and I should pop up as basically the first result.
I literally did it before this podcast and it popped right up. So it's funny though, when you search that title, I think an old one comes up first. So definitely search, also make sure Milo's on the paper. So you get the one Milo was on and the most up-to-date one. And I just want to say a massive thank you again, Milo, for coming on the podcast and for the research you're doing. And yeah, definitely guys, check out everything there. And if you are interested in participating, being part of science, being part of making us all more jacked and strong, definitely get involved with that. And I guess we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Steve.
Losing weight fast while maintaining muscle mass. Sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? It isn't though. It's reality and we know how to do it. And we will help you achieve this. The Minicut Movement is an 8-week fat loss program to make you lose a huge chunk of fat while maintaining muscle mass at the same time. We will support you from the beginning to the end so that you see the results you would like to and come out of it much stronger. You'll receive a fully automated spreadsheet that is based on your nutritional needs. You can choose between 6 different male and female training templates. Over 30 videos will guide you through each and every single step of the Minicut so that you're getting the most out of your journey and that you always know what to do. But the best thing is that you can start whenever you want. The Minicut Movement is open 24/7. So if you want to learn more or you're ready to sign up, hit the link in the description below. So let's revive stronger together.